everybody, and welcome to a very special show here at Brooklands, Surrey in the UK. Today we'll be showcasing Concorde Delta Golf, going around the aircraft with flight engineer Ian Smith. But before we do that, let's get some history on the aircraft with Concorde lead trainer John Carter.
Concorde is very closely linked to Brooklands. One of our most celebrated engineers, Sir Barnes Wallis, was working here with Vickers, and he started to experiment with supersonic flight. Indeed, he built models here which were destined to fly supersonically. The other work that Barnes Wallis did was associated with aerodynamics, in particular in relation to the engine intakes, where the air has to be slowed from 1,350 miles an hour to 500 miles an hour within 11 feet in order for the engines to operate efficiently. As we moved into the development phase of Concorde, the French and the British governments agreed to collaborate in the development of Concorde, and the first meetings of the teams to develop that aircraft took place in Paris and here at Brooklands in 1961. So from then on, a lot of the design work was done here, and as we moved into the development phase of the aircraft, the teams agreed that production of the parts for Concorde would be split between the two teams. Certain bits of all 20 Concordes were built in the UK, and so the other bits were built in France. The teams then swapped those pieces to the two construction sites, Filton for the British Concordes and Toulouse for the French Concordes. And 30% of the airframe of all 20 Concordes were built right here at Brooklands. And that includes the 90 miles of wiring that every Concorde contained. So that is why Brooklands has become known, in our view, as the home of Concorde. Delta Golf was the first of the 8 British production Concordes, but she never actually went into airline service. Instead, she was used for 3 very special purposes. First of all, she was a demonstration aircraft. She flew around the world demonstrating Concorde to airlines and governments. Secondly, in the summer of 1975, Delta Golf was used as a training aircraft for the first generation of British Airways Concorde pilots. And lastly, Delta Golf was the Concorde that did most of the test flying to obtain the certificate of airworthiness. In other words, its license to carry passengers. And it was during that phase of her life that Delta Golf has become truly immortal, because she was the first Concorde, and therefore the first aircraft in history to carry 100 passengers at twice the speed of sound. When Delta Golf was taken out of service in 1981, she was taken to Filton, and she was acquired by British Airways in 1983 and was essentially used for spares. When Concorde was taken out of service in 2003, British Airways gave Concorde to the museum, but she had to be cut into 5 pieces and transported from Filton to here, and over the course of 3 years, together with our team of engineers and a contractor, we put her back together again into what you see today.
So thank you to Concorde lead trainer John Carter there, giving us some great history on the Brooklands Concorde. Now we're going to be meeting up with Ian Smith, who was a flight engineer on the Concorde, and he's going to be walking us around the entire aircraft, inside the cabin and up to the cockpit. This nose right at the tip was around about, what was it,
127 degrees centigrade. That was the limit. The reason they chose that was that the aircraft was built out of aluminium-based alloys, and to give a reasonable fatigue life, they had to restrict it to that speed so as it wouldn't overheat and then reduce the fatigue life. Yes, the noses, they could reach 127, and if we were cruising along in supersonic flight, if it tried to go above that, if the autopilot was flying it, it would automatically slow the aeroplane down to bring it back to that limit. That was the factor involved in that Mach 2 speed.
You've got some deflectors there.
The reason they had that is when the aeroplane was flying at low speeds, sort of below 250 knots, say, it was to channel the airflow down and make the airflow closer to the fuselage so as the rudders became more effective.
Now, one of the big things that is quite apparent is the fact that you are around about 30 feet from the cockpit to the nose gear, resulted in a huge turning circle.
Look at the VC-10 just behind Concorde. See where the nose wheel is that compared to the flight deck, the cockpit of that. So when you're taxiing and going round corners and things, you were sitting near the front of the aeroplane. On Concorde, when you come back to this and you see the distance,
Yes.
the pilots actually went right over the grass to turn.
Yes.
And because it's so long out there to the flight deck, if we are taxiing on a sort of slightly rough taxiway or even in the runway, if you were down the back of the cabin and looked all the way up to the flight deck, you could see us bouncing up and down at the front of the airplane. Although it's an aluminium-based alloy, it's slightly different to other materials that were used in aircraft, but it was still effectively low cost or lower cost than going to things like stainless steel and titanium.
And of course, such a high undercarriage.
Yes, the whole undercarriage, the mains as well, it had to be off the ground because as you rotated to come off the ground and the back of the aeroplane came very close to the ground, it's a totally different aerodynamics compared to a subsonic wing. The shape of it changed quite considerably. You might just catch along the leading edge the way it curves up and down.
Yes, yes.
It's three-dimensional. You see how thin the wing is at the outer part there? That's actually a fuel tank as well. All that wingtip contained 2.5 tons of fuel. So the designers did an amazing job, which is really a very tiny aeroplane with a lot of little tanks, 13 fuel tanks in this thing. As the airplane accelerates, the centre of lift moves rearwards in the wing. So what we did, we moved fuel to alter the centre of gravity, so it just matched the centre of lift movement in the wing. When we were at 190 knots, say in the outer approach, we were using the same amount of fuel as we did cruising at twice the speed of sound.
I believe this was a skid on the initial aircraft.
The very first one was a skid, and then the next one had the little wheels, and it had this concept. If we're training new pilots, the very odd occasion you'd maybe see the little wheel marks. This is a vastly developed engine. The original engines, I think they developed maybe probably about 12,000 pounds of thrust, and then they gradually increased to 20,000. The reason they chose this engine was that in supersonic flight, a jet engine will only accept a supersonic airflow up to about 1.5 times the speed of sound. We had to slow it down, so we had this intake in the front to reduce that. In 11 feet of intake, it goes from twice the speed of sound to half the speed of sound. For the thrust we required on takeoff, it would really have meant we had to carry an extra engine. So
Yes.
we resorted to the reheater after burning. All it really was injecting fuel at the back of the engine, lighting it up, expanded the air a bit more and gave us the extra thrust. We sprayed fuel in, and the flame attached to this gutter, they called it, held the flame alight and working for the reheat. This is the rear cargo door, and that's the bulkhead. This part here is where the galley would be. The rear doors were in the galley area, these doors. When it came to the museum, this was really just a shell, so they decided to put certain things on display. These are the airlines that were going to buy Concorde.
Yes.
So a lot of these airlines decided they weren't going to go to the expense of it. And here you can see the example of the seating. It was a small aeroplane, but it had to be this size. It couldn't be like a jumbo jet to fly at these speeds. But we wouldn't ever put 100 seats in it.
This nose fairing actually came off the one at Filton. So there was an accident at Heathrow. So DG donated her nose, the one that's now at Filton, and this is the one at Filton. But it was halfway through being refurbed when she stopped flying. So all the systems in the movable part of the nose down there wasn't there. So we had to effectively recreate all of that. Everything in kind of the fuselage structure, so everything under the floor here was still there. The procedure for this specific aircraft is slightly different, that we have to pull the emergency release handle to get the nose down. But shall I just go through it now then? Shall I start?
most
Right,
definitely.
so
Yep.
so first you need to turn the hydraulic pressure on, and then it works as per it should do from the normal nose and visor selector valve.
So that goes into the nose.
So yes, at this point I'd be able to just go to the next section, which is nose 5 degrees, and then the nose comes down. So there should be a nice click. Sure is.
Okay.
So this is the point where she was misbehaving, and she's working this morning. There we go.
We had to comply with various air traffic instructions and things.
Yes.
But if we went above 270 knots, that's 300 miles an hour, then we streamlined the aeroplane. We put the nose and visor up, and it became fully streamlined. And then, of course, as we slowed down through 300, we put it all down again.
Yes.
So we went to the mid position, as James had mentioned there, 5 degrees with the visor down, and then just before landing we'd pop the nose fully down. Final approach, but the pilot would be flying about 10.5 degrees nose up attitude, so you wouldn't see over the nose.
Well, thank you to Ian and John and James, of course, for showing us around Delta Golf. And of course, great to see that nose still working after all these years. And congratulations to James for making that happen. Now we're going to go on board the Concorde Simulator here at Brooklands, meeting up with Ian again. So let's go fly.
So all the checks were completed, and we wait, get the air traffic clearance, and there we go. So that's the throttle's been pushed fully forward, the engines would power up, the reheats would light up, and the aircraft would accelerate. With about 100 knots, we should have a check of all the engines. There was a little green light for each engine, would tell us we'd full power. We'd get to the decision speed V1. If we had a failure before that, we would stop. If failure was after, we'd take failure into the air and sort it out then. We get to the point, rotate, pilot pull the control column back, and on our instruments we'd pitch up to a preset position, and the airplane would rotate and climb away. In the Atlantic, between the positions, the waypoints in the Atlantic, at a subsonic aeroplane it's about an hour between these points. On Concorde it's 20 minutes. So during that time there's various checks to be done. So you are actually working virtually the whole time during these flights.
Okay.
It's not one of these aeroplanes, you get airborne, put the autopilot and then read the paper.
Yes.
It's an aeroplane you had to monitor the whole time.
Yes, yes, right.
During the cruise, we mentioned the flight engineer moving fuel.
Yeah.
That was mainly during the acceleration up to supersonic speeds.
Yes.
But in the cruise, we trimmed the aeroplane. We had an instrument down in the bottom that showed where our flying controls were positioned.
Interesting.
And we moved fuel to position that in the most streamlined position, because that was the least drag, more fuel efficient. So we pumped fuel fore and aft and left and right to keep the controls in the streamline. The Concorde was a very controllable aeroplane. The performance, for example, taking off from New York with a very special noise abatement procedure, and we could achieve that because the airplane was so controllable. In an automatic landing, because the engines are controlled electronically, and because the flying controls are electronic, fly-by-wire, it was very smooth, and with little wings, so crosswinds didn't have a huge problem. We always took off full power. The aeroplane is actually just above landing weight. It's a very light aircraft.
Wow.
What we would do is we would fly a circuit and overshoot, not touch down, and then the next one we would land. So the airplane was light, full power. It really went off like a scalded cat. The pilots there, the idea of circuit height, 1,500 feet.
Circuit height 1,500 feet.
The training captain always got clearance above that. I won't tell you what the record is how high we've got in the past, but we often exceeded that in the first takeoff.
Wow.
Because it was a case of you got off the ground, you got to 250 knots, and you got the reheats off, throttled back.
Yeah.
You had to nail it.
Yes.
So things happen much quicker. So to get the pilot, although you'd been in the simulator and you'd done all this couldn't replicate with the real airplane.